Hi, this is Tim of the 1916 Company. Welcome and thanks for logging on. If you love this watch, email us, Team Mosso at the1916company.com for purchase pricing and availability questions concerning this watch. Today, we are discussing what might be the most distinctive generation of Omega's best-known Seamaster model line. So the original Diver 300 meter came out in 1993 and rose to fame on the wrist of Pierce Brosnan during his 4-film turn as Agent 007. It was in the movies, it was in pop culture, you saw it in video games. It was the first Seamaster model that had the same kind of pop culture street cred as the long-running Rolex Submariner. But what it also had, because of its rise to fame, was design stability, as Omega kept the Seamaster design in the catalog long after previous generations of the watch would have gone through a full redesign. So the bond connection was enough to keep the Diver 300 meter more or less along the same lines in the catalog from 93 to the present day. But it was this generation, made from 2012 to 2017, that stands out the most because of its use of a smooth polished lacquer dial rather than the wave-style dial that came before and after this generation. Now, there's no mistaking it for what it is, Diver 300 meter, but people have very strong feelings about this generation. And I have to say, as the owner of a first generation with the printed indices, the matte finished blue wave dial, I actually think this looks like a much more expensive watch, more Rolex than 90s Omega. So let's throw this on the wrist and see how it feels. It's a familiar friend. 41 millimeters in diameter, it's 13.1 millimeters thick, which by 2025 Omega standards, especially their dive watches, is actually pretty thin. Lug-to-lug, 48 millimeters, but if we include the end links, this generation has solid end links, then it's 52.1 millimeters lug-to-lug with a 20 millimeter spacing between the lugs. I know this watch wears well on my wrist because I owned the previous generation of it. It's a good fit if your wrists are as small as 14 centimeters circumference. And so it's a little bit more versatile than the rather chunky Planet Oceans. Taking a look at the bracelet, it definitely improved in quality over the years. I would argue that the biggest change for this bracelet was the move to screw-fixed removable links in this generation. It makes for a much more upscale bracelet, no pin sleeves. Pin sleeves are fine, they're durable and whatnot, and they won't back out, and they can't strip out, but you expect screws in a premium product these days, and so Omega does step up with this generation and give you that. You can also see there's an intermediate-sized link in there in case you find yourself in between link sizes, and then there is a fold-out all-or-nothing dive extension that, like the rest of the clasp, is reassuringly thick-gauge steel. And I should say that this clasp, when it debuted in the 90s, is probably the single reason that Rolex moved to shore up the quality of its clasps and really bracelets too during the 2000s. This was a wake-up call. Robust, affordably priced, impressively manufactured. This was the beginning of the end of Rolex's hollow center links, stamped clasps, rather thin gauge steel, divots drilled through the side of the clasp. This was a real wake-up call, and Rolex responded, but it's important to note Omega was there to wake it up. Taking a look, we have a combination of satin and polish. The characters are still very deep and distinct. This is a well-preserved watch. I would argue that these links are probably a little bit more squared off than on earlier versions of the bracelet, which is to say they don't roll to the side so much. Not quite as much. They're not as squared off as the current generation of the bracelet, but this is definitely a lot less overtly dressy than the first version that Pierce wore and which I own. But it's always been a bracelet that's somewhere between a sports bracelet and a dress bracelet. And I think these relatively small links with the polished intermediates have generally been the source of that dichotomy. We have a conforming end link. Doesn't turn it into a nautilus, but it does nicely mate the bracelet to the case. Lyre-style lugs, so we have both the inward and outward bevel, with the outward bevel featuring polish. Helium escape valve for saturation divers. If you're one of the, 300 people in the U.S. actually certified for this, you might be down hours, days, even weeks, and during your one big decompression, you want to make sure this is open so that helium that gets into the watch during the dive can exit without blowing out the seals or the crystal. And as long as you open this up before the decompression takes place, when the internal pressure exceeds external by 2 to 3 bar, again, if you've opened the valve, then it will release the helium and you'll have no problems. Very few people need this, and it's a great conversation piece. Both are true at the same time. Screw down crown, 300 meter water resistance, A very vocal 120-click unidirectional diving bezel. Now, of course, my generation of this watch had an aluminum insert. This is ceramic. You line up the skeleton hands, which are affectionately known as the Bond-style hands, with the bezel. Now you have a 0 to 60-minute count-up timer. Let's do a Lume shot. One thing Omega gets right here is that all three hands are luminescent, so you know if your backup dive timer is running. Also, the dual tone Lume, where you can read the minute hand against the pearl at a glance, very helpful for reading that time at a glance when time is of the essence. The dial, upscale compared to what Pierce and I once had, as we have an applied Omega logo, marquee, and indices, but it's that super gloss blue lacquer. There's also a black lacquer version. This is very divisive among fans of this model. I actually like it. I think it makes it look more expensive, and I think it makes it look more refined. The previous wave dials, they're handsome, they're fun, and they're distinctive, but given that this is the only generation that looks like this, it's always going to be the one that stands out. And I think that this was the right way to go to make the watch look more expensive than it is. And that is always a good thing in the luxury space. Now, in terms of how it works, well, you've got a caliber 2500 in here, and it's got all the good stuff, all the revisions to the 2500 over the years, a modern lubrication scheme. Remember, the 2500 Alpha was unlubricated. It has the bridge revised a la 2500 Bravo. It has the move to the more modern beat rate, 25,200 vibrations per hour as of variant Charlie, and it has the tri-level coaxial, which is the most stable and durable version, where you have the drive to the coaxial escape wheel on one level, and then you have the impulsing faces on the two stacked coaxial levels above that. So the tri-level, where one of the escape facets does not have to also act as the end of the gear train. That's what the tri-level means. So it also has other refinements. By the way, you can see the hippocampus on the back, the seahorse, reminding you this is a Seamaster. The 2500, of course, is based on the ETA 2892A2. This is coaxialized, and as I mentioned, it has all the running changes to the 2500. 48-hour power reserve, beat rate of 25,200 vibrations per hour. It features a free sprung balance, 5-position adjustment, chronometer certification, and of course 27 pivot jewels along with hacking and the quick set date. So lots to love. And if you love this watch, reach out to Team Mosso at the 1916company.com for purchase and pricing details.